to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5 is where we'll find our first reference tonight. Travis Fanning reminded me right before I got up here, he said, if you're preaching on Father's Day, you're preaching to yourself this year. And I told him that I usually am preaching to myself, but it does hit a little bit different this time. And so that's an interesting feeling. A few weeks ago on Mother's Day, I preached a sermon here called The Gospel in Motherhood, looking at some important lessons that teach us about our relationship with God that are communicated through examples of motherhood in the Bible and in the daily lives of Christians. And so today we're following up on that, talking about fatherhood on Father's Day. And it's interesting to me, just as I was researching some things in preparation for this sermon, it's interesting that the idea for Father's Day as a holiday came from a sermon on Mother's Day back in the early 1900s. And then Mother's Day was made a national holiday by President Woodrow Wilson in 1914. And my understanding of his reasoning for doing that was to promote strong motherhood as essential to having strong and healthy families. And, of course, that is necessary to having a strong and healthy nation. The interesting thing to me is that Father's Day was not declared a national holiday until 1972, 58 years later. And so the question that came into my mind was, if the goal was to promote strong and healthy families and a strong home, then why was only one parent celebrated by the nation in this way? And the lesson there, to me, is that if we are looking to the culture around us to find the answers of a strong home or to develop a healthy worldview or to progress towards truth, we're going to fall short. And even when our culture does good things, Mother's Day is a good thing. It is a good thing to celebrate mothers. But even when our culture does good things, it will never be enough until we are leaning wholly on God and on God's design and using His wisdom. And so this afternoon, rather than simply fatherhood, we're going to be using the term patriarchy. And I have some different reasons for doing this. The main reason is because I'm going to guess that some of you cringed when I used the word patriarchy. Because the idea of patriarchy has been hijacked. It's been villainized by worldly philosophies whose goal is to destroy the home, God's design for the home. And they are not shy about that fact. When you read some of the authors and the writings that these ideas come from, they're very plain that is their goal in changing the definitions of these words. And we'll talk more about that as we go, but it is so important that we maintain a biblical concept and a biblical practice of patriarchy, even as the world around us tries to redefine and demonize it. But also, when we properly define patriarchy, we are talking about more than what we generally think of as fatherhood. Just like we did on Mother's Day, it is good to be sentimental. It's good to focus on good feelings and gratitude towards the people who have raised us. But in a culture that is increasingly blurring the lines in regards to the home, I think that it is important that we go beyond only that and that we consider just how important strong patriarchs are in God's plan for His people. And so that's what we are going to do tonight. And I want to begin by talking about the need for this lesson due to the attack on patriarchy, I believe, is very active in our culture, in our country today. But we have to begin by defining what we're talking about. The word that is translated patriarch in the New Testament and in Greek translations of the Old Testament is patriarches. I'm not even trying to pronounce it right, but the idea is it's used in Acts 2 and verse 29 to describe David, in Acts chapter 7 and verse 9 there to describe the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel, the sons of Jacob, and in Hebrews chapter 7 talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if you look in like 1st, 2nd Chronicles, it is used to talk about the heads of the father's household, is a phrase that you will see a lot. And the word comes from 2 different Greek words, the etymology of it. You have patrio, which is family, and then you have archo, which means to be first in rank. And so really it just means that the head of the house, head of the household. And the way that the Bible describes the role of patriarchs, and I'm simplifying this a lot for sake of time, is that they are to be the heads of their wives, to lead their wives in a self-sacrificing and Christ-like way. That is the Ephesians chapter 5 reference there, and we will look at that in more detail later on. They are to bring their children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Some translations say training and or discipline and instruction. That is in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4, right down below the last reference. They are to provide for their households in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8. They are to submit to Christ first as their head with all of the responsibilities that entails, as they then lead their families under Christ's authority in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 3. And as we talk about patriarchy tonight, this is the image that I want for us to think of. I don't want for us to see the kind of patriarchy that our culture has put forth, that they have shoved into our minds through media, through books, through movies, and all of those things. I want us to see God's vision for what patriarchy looks like. And so a good working definition, I hope, for our discussion tonight might look something like this on the screen behind me. We're talking about God's design for male leadership in the home. And maybe even beyond the home. We'll talk about that some as well. But that is not the world's definition. Even if we're talking about the very same things, that is not how the world sees these things. The Google AI definition, for whatever that's worth, of patriarchy is a social system in which men hold primary power, dominating roles in political leadership, moral authority, social privilege, and control of property. You see what they did with those words? You see how they flipped the tone of this on its head? They turned this into a conflict. They borrow the language, it's actually very clear, they borrow the language that Karl Marx applied to class and socioeconomic status. They took those same ideas and applied them to male-female relationships, to interpret society as competing groups that are fighting for power rather than different responsibilities that God has given. They say that patriarchy is about domination rather than leadership and responsibility. Those are very different concepts. Following this philosophy, the goal is not righteousness. The goal is not having a healthy family structure. In this worldview, every single relationship is interpreted in terms of power and oppression. It's a depressing worldview. But this is what secularism leads to. When we take God out of the conversation, I don't care if we're in politics, I don't care if we're in church, I don't care if we're in the home or at work or school, anything. When we take God out of the conversation, this is where it is going to lead every single time. We end up in the culture of the book of Judges. When the goal is no longer guided by God, or at least in line with God's design, then there are no more rules anymore. There is no authority, but whatever we make up as we go along. And so as it says in Judges 21:25, there is no king in Israel. Everyone does what is right in their own eyes. You notice that even in that sentence, that the problem in Israel was a lack of strong male leadership in the nation. There was no king. They needed one. They had one. They ignored him. But throughout the book of Judges, you can see the theme of weak men as being a primary issue in their culture. Even in the people that are lifted up as heroes, you can see the weakness of men in that culture. Gideon was constantly hiding from responsibility at the beginning of his story, but once God helped him and he got a little confidence, he turned into a bloodthirsty warlord who couldn't control himself sexually and had many wives and concubines. His son Abimelech, which, by the way, the name Abimelech means son of the king. Who do you think Gideon thought he was? Abimelech followed in his footsteps. Jephthah's rash oath resulted in the death of his daughter. Manoah displays a very fragile masculinity in Judges chapter 13. His son Samson can't stop sleeping with prostitutes and pagan women and telling them all his secrets. And the final story in Judges deals with rampant homosexuality and a Levite woman who has a Levite man who has a rocky relationship with a concubine. But the most obvious failure of patriarchy during this time period, if you'd like to turn to Judges 4, happens in the time of Deborah. There are many today who hold up Deborah as a feminist icon, but if you actually read the story of Deborah, that is not the case at all. It was not Deborah who God called to deliver Israel. In Judges chapter 4 and verse 6, Deborah sent and calls for Barak, the son of Abinoam from Kadesh, and Naphtali said to him, "Has not the Lord God of Israel commanded you? Go and deploy troops to Mount Tabor. Take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and the sons of Zebulun. Fight Jabin's army." But in verse 8, Barak replied, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." Barak wasn't going to go and do what God told him to do unless Deborah held his hand. And we know the story there right after this. She says, "Surely I will go with you, Barak, but nevertheless there will be no glory for you in this journey that you are taking, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman." And we know that Jael takes this tent peg and drives it through his skull, and it's just really epic. But this was not the way that it should have been. Deborah and Jael had to do the work that God sent Barak to do. This was not their job. Deborah even appears to allude to the fact that she had to act because there were no strong men in Israel. In Judges chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, she's saying, "Village life ceased. It ceased in Israel until I, Deborah, arose a mother in Israel. They chose new gods. There was war in the gates, and not a shield or a spear was seen around among 40,000 in Israel." There was no one to do the job that men were supposed to do. And so Deborah had to do it. The same thing has been true in our culture for a very long time, in that spiritual leadership has been seen as a woman's role. If not in concept, then at least that's the way it's been in practice. Who is the one pushing church attendance? Who is the one teaching the kids about God at home? Who is the one leading study and prayer? For most of recent memory, most of our society has been led by women like Deborah because men like Barak abdicated their duty. But if you look at recent statistics, it's actually really surprising. I was expecting to find something very different when I was researching this. But according to Barna Research in 2025, men are attending church more frequently than women. It's not very common in the history of our country. Most of that change is due to men under the age of 30 being the most religious demographic in our nation, and married fathers being the most religiously active parent group. That's a very recent change in our culture, but it hasn't been normal for a very long time. And so we need to be ready to support, encourage, and celebrate when men lead in their families and in church and keep this trend going. Sometimes the problem isn't that men have abdicated their role. Sometimes it is true that they abuse it. That is the case with Nabal in 1 Samuel chapter 25. In 1 Samuel chapter 25, this story takes place when David and his men are hiding from King Saul. They're in need of some help, and they had been protecting and providing for Nabal's men. In exchange, they requested to join this very, very rich man on feast day. And instead of being a gracious host and paying back David and his men for all the work that they had been doing for him, Nabal was very insulting towards David. He says in verse 10, "Who is David? Who is this son of Jesse? There are many servants nowadays who break away, each one from his master." And so David hears this message, and he tells his men, "Gird on your swords. We're going to go kill this guy." And while Nabal's wife, Abigail, is running around trying to put food together to meet David and his men on the road to appease David for her husband's sake, where is Nabal? In verse 36, he is throwing himself a feast fit for a king without his wife, and he is becoming very drunk. And in this case, Abigail takes responsibility for her husband, not only because he isn't doing his job, but because, as it says in verse 3, he was a harsh and evil man. If you put a pin in that thought, so kind of come back to it in a second, but I want to think for a moment about the phrase toxic masculinity. That phrase, just for starters, I don't think that phrase belongs anywhere in a Christian's vocabulary. I think it's an incredibly deceptive phrase. This phrase was coined in the 1980s to describe certain traits in men that were deemed to be toxic. Then it evolved to be used to describe certain cultural expectations of manhood, and then finally it began to be used by many people not to describe certain traits, but to call masculinity itself toxic. And I want to suggest to you that toxic masculinity has never, ever been a problem in the history of the world. It was not a problem in the book of Judges. It was not a problem even with harsh and evil men like Nabal. Toxic masculinity was not the problem. Lack of masculinity was the problem. And when men abdicate their responsibilities as men, or when men corrupt and abuse their positions as men, then it is not toxic. That word doesn't even mean anything. We've used it so much. It's sinful, not toxic. That's God's language. What do we do when these things happen? When men fail to be righteous in their leadership, when men fail to act like men, I would suggest to you that the solution is not to give up on God's design for his creation. The solution is not to tear down the patriarchy. The solution is to promote true patriarchy. I'm not talking about just put men in charge of their families, put men in masculine roles. I'm talking about following God's design all the way to the top. Not just more masculine men, but men under Christ. I'm talking about men submitting to Christ and then leading others to him. And when that happens, strong, godly men will hold those who neglect and abuse their role and make the rest of us look bad. We will hold them accountable. Let's talk about redeeming patriarchy. I'm not denying that we live in a society that is full of weak men, but the solution is not to demonize masculinity. It is to promote it, to restore it, to be godly, and to celebrate when it is. In 1 Corinthians, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians for a little while. In chapter 16, as Paul concluded that letter he wrote to the church of Corinth, he says, "Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong." What does this mean? What should we learn from this? For one thing, men acting like men is not a bad thing. Men acting like men is needed. And a lot of the problems that were going on in the church of Corinth were because men were not acting like men. This is the solution to the problem. And so as you track the problems through 1 Corinthians, in chapter 1, you have divisions forming under worldly allegiances, personal preferences. You have people following men instead of following Christ. You have a society that refuses the wisdom of God. What is needed? In verse 22, it says, "The Jews request a sign, the Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. To the Jews, this is a stumbling block. To the Greeks, it is foolishness. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God." Speak the truth, even when everyone else is against you. When you are persecuted, speak the truth. Stand firm, act like men, be strong. In chapter 3, verse 12 and 13, "If anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become clear, for the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire. And the fire will test each one's work of what sort it is." And so there's a day of fire coming. I tend to think that this is talking about a day of persecution and trial when faith is tested, borrowing language from the Old Testament here. But when that day comes, stand firm, be strong, act like men. In chapter 5, when a Christian is living in sin, like the man who had his father's wife, the problem in Corinth in verse 2 was that they acted like nothing was wrong with this. The result in verse 6 was that others in the group were in danger of being influenced by their behavior. And so be watchful, act like men, be strong. Chapter 6, brethren going to court with one another over physical disagreements. Verse 5, "Is it not so that there is not a wise man among you, not even one who is able to judge between his brethren?" When there is a conflict, someone needs to come into that conflict and be the peacemaker. Be watchful, act like men, be strong. Chapter 9 is all about self-denial for the sake of the gospel. We will see that as a hallmark of true masculinity and godly patriarchy. We've already mentioned that with marriage in Ephesians chapter 5, but Paul talks about all that he gave up in order to be a Christian in the first half of the chapter. And then he talks about the sacrifice of becoming all things to all men. In verse 27, he says, I discipline my body, I bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself might become disqualified. Self-control, self-discipline, stand firm, act like men, be strong. Chapter 11, talking about the head covering, we already mentioned, submit to Christ, lead your family, act like men. Chapter 13, verses 4 through 7, love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy, love does not parade itself, love is not arrogant, it does not behave rudely, it does not seek its own, it is not provoked, it thinks no evil, it does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. How many bad ideas of masculinity do these few verses address? It's interesting, in chapter 16, right after the verse that we referenced that says, act like men, the very next verse says, let all that you do be done with love. That's part of acting like a man. In chapter 14, in verses 34 and 35, it says, let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says. And if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for women to speak in church. Why? Why is this the case? I would say that it's for the same reason that it was shameful for Deborah to go into battle. It's because this is the man's responsibility. It's our job to fulfill this role. And rather than defining what Paul meant by act like men through our own culture and through our own learned stereotypes, why not define it by the problems that Paul is telling them that this will solve? He's telling them to speak the truth, to stand firm in it, to endure suffering, to exercise self-control, to prioritize other people before themselves, to make peace when there is conflict, to lead their families, to lead the church, to love sacrificially, to take care of people, to protect people, to defend people, and ultimately to submit to Christ. The first line in the Song of Deborah there in Judges chapter 5 and verse 1, it says, when leaders led in Israel, when the people volunteered, bless Yahweh. It was the lack of leadership, it was the lack of people who were volunteering to do the work that needed to be done that led to all of the problems in that time. And I think the same thing was true in Corinth for all of their divisions, all of their compromises. Why is it so important that men act like men? It's because when we follow our God-given roles, there is order. This is the way God created us to be. The opposite of that is chaos. That's what was happening in Corinth, both in families and in the local church. Those things have a big impact on one another. And the solution was not to overthrow the traditional order of patriarchy. It was to establish it in righteousness. Well, what does that look like? If you'd like to turn to Job chapter 31. Job chapter 31. I have a whole lesson I've done here a couple years ago comparing Job 31 and Proverbs 31 as profiles of what it looks like to be good men and good women. And when you look at Job 31, as we're about to do, what you discover is I think that the primary characteristic that describes a good man is restraint. Restraint implies that you have the strength and you have the ability to do some damage, but instead you use that strength for good. If the only reason that you don't do bad things is because you can't do bad things, that doesn't make you a very good person. That's just doing what you can do. But if you have strength and you are in the position of a patriarch, you can choose to be like Nabal or you can choose to be like Job. In verse 1, Job made a covenant with his eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? Same thing we read from Paul, self-discipline, self-control. In verse 5, Job didn't walk in falsehood, but in verse 6, integrity. He might have had the ability to cheat or to steal or to game the system, but he wanted to be weighed on honest scales. As a patriarch, Job's word meant something. In verse 9, Job did not allow his heart to be enticed by a woman. He didn't go looking to spend time alone with someone who was not his wife. For all the polygamy that there was in the Old Testament, especially polygamy among the wealthy and the powerful men in the Old Testament, Job is the greatest of all of the men in the East, and he has stayed true to his one wife. Verse 13, Job did not rule over his servants with an iron fist, but when they made complaints against him, he listened. He did not consider himself to be superior to them in worth. But in verse 15, he says, did not he who made me in the womb make them? Just because he had a role that was of higher authority, that did not make them inferior to be walked all over. In verse 16, Job did not oppress the widow or the poor. In fact, he used his position to help those people. In verse 18, he adopted the orphans. He raised them as a father, like a true patriarch. He guided the widow. He cared for her. He clothed the poor and the naked. Verse 19. Verse 24 and 25, he did not rejoice in his wealth or boast about it. He was not enticed by the worship of things that were not God, but he recognized, he served the God that these blessings came from. Verse 29, he did not rejoice in the destruction of his enemies or even curse them. In verse 30, and rather than using his wealth for his own benefit, verse 31 and 32, he took care of his people. He fed them, and it says that he fed them with meat, with good food. And not only his own people, but he opened his tent to strangers. Verse 33, he did not hide, he did not cover up his sin because he feared the people, but he was honest about his faults. It's interesting, some translations, my translation, New King James, says, if I have covered my transgressions as Adam. Well, what did Adam do? Rather than taking accountability for his choices, he blamed it all on his wife. That's not what true godly patriarchs like Job do. Verse 38, Job took care of his property. He wasn't lazy. He worked. And in verse 39, he took care of those people who worked for him. Well, what do all of these things tell us about Job? Job was not concerned with building himself up. He was the greatest man in all of the East, but he didn't get there by taking advantage of people. He didn't get there by gaming the system. He got there by being a godly leader, got there by prioritizing the people who were under him and by doing what was best for the people under his charge. Not by doing what was easy, not by doing what was comfortable or what might have been desirable for him to do, but doing what was right, what was just and fair. And by restraining himself from what he could have done, that may have been more physically rewarding for him in the short term. When we think about that kind of restraint, who better to think of than Jesus? I think Job is a picture of Jesus here. That even when such great injustice was done to Jesus, kind of like a lot of injustice had been done to Job, Jesus demonstrated maybe even a greater restraint by not calling that legion of angels to destroy the Romans and to set him free. He chose rather to submit to his Father, to sacrifice himself, because that was what was best for the people under his authority. Masculine strength is a controlled strength. It doesn't mean we're never aggressive. Even Jesus could be aggressive. But it means that even when we are aggressive, we are controlled, we are measured, and it is for the benefit or for the protection of others. Godly patriarchy is not the ability to exert strength. It's the ability to steward strength. When we think about patriarchy, this is the sort of thing we should be thinking about. This is the patriarchy that belongs to a biblical worldview. The world has really done a remarkable job of propagandizing their own distorted view. And I know this isn't really the traditional Father's Day sermon, but I think reinforcing, retraining our minds to exalt and to glorify God's definition of patriarchy, I think that's an important way that we can celebrate godly fathers and also challenge ourselves to fit better into this vision. So I hope this is helping to do that. But a lot of what we have been covering is talking about godly masculinity in general, and I do want to apply some of these things more specifically to fatherhood. In Genesis chapter 18 and verse 19, this is right before God starts to talk to Abraham about the destruction or the potential destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And God is talking to himself in this passage, and he's deciding with himself about whether or not he is going to let Abraham in on this decision about what he is planning to do to Sodom and Gomorrah. And ultimately, God decided he is going to talk to Abraham. And he says in verse 19, "For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they may keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring Abraham what he has spoken to him." That verse begs the question, well, what does any of that have to do with whether or not God should tell Abraham about Sodom and Gomorrah about to get nuked? And I think the answer is that God is communicating about his decision to judge these people. That has something to do with Abraham's training as a patriarch. Abraham is responsible, God says, for commanding his household in such a way that they keep the way of the Lord. Well, what does that mean? It's God's way. It's the path that God walks. Abraham's household is supposed to walk that path with him. They're to be like God. And if Abraham is going to help his household to be like God, then Abraham needs to become like God himself. He needs to learn how to parent like God parents and make judgments like God makes judgments. He needs to know about enforcing righteousness and justice. He needs to know what happens when those things are not upheld. And it's interesting because what kind of masculinity do we find in Sodom and Gomorrah? Other than Lot, I would argue that there is none at all. We see no self-restraint. We see no self-control. We see no hospitality. We see no protection of the vulnerable. We see no men acting like men. What we do see is chaos that goes up into a ball of smoke. And in order to be a good patriarch, Abraham has to command his household. He has to do it righteously and fairly in accordance with the way of the Lord. And Abraham has to make sacrifices. He has to move all around and live in tents. He has to be circumcised. He has to leave his father's household. He has to leave the religion that he was raised with. He puts God even above his own children. He sends Ishmael away. He's willing to sacrifice Isaac, and guess what? That's what was best for his children. I think one of the most dangerous qualities to Christian men today, that is prevalent today, is passivity. That's the idea of letting things happen without resistance, letting things happen to you rather than being proactive, taking initiative. You are failing to take charge of situations and you're reacting to them instead of being proactive in leadership. And we see passivity as a consistent problem for men throughout time, failing to take the responsibility to lead. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6, did Adam see his wife reaching for the fruit of the forbidden tree and try to stop her? No. Or when he realized what she had done, did he put his foot down and say, that is not the way that we do things around here? No. She also gave to her husband, and he ate. He let it happen. He submitted to outside influence. Genesis chapter 16 and verse 2, Sarah knows that God promised Abraham a nation through his lineage, but she hasn't had a son. And so she says, the Lord has restrained me from having children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I will obtain a son by her. And Abraham said, God promised he would give me a son. God gave me you as a wife. God is faithful and he will do it. No. He submitted. It says that Abraham heeded the voice of his wife. 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 13, a man of God has come to Eli and warned him that he had better get his boys in line, that they've been sleeping with the women who come to worship at the tabernacle. They've been stealing God's portions of the sacrifices. And so Eli told his sons to stop it. But he just used words. He kind of slapped them on the wrist, and his sons did not stop. And so God says, I will judge this house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile and he did not restrain them. Boys will be boys. I told them no, they just didn't listen. What else can I do? It's passivity. If you contrast that against Nehemiah, one of the best, the most proactive leaders in the Bible, in chapter 1 of Nehemiah finds out that the wall of Jerusalem was broken down, the gates are burned with fire, and so he mourns and he weeps and he fasts and he prays for many days. Chapter 2, he has an opportunity to do something about it. Artaxerxes comes to him and says, why are you so sad? And Nehemiah said, why shouldn't I be sad when the place of my father's tombs lies in waste? And Artaxerxes says, what do you request? And the amazing thing to me is that Nehemiah had an answer for that. He said, he wasn't just moping about it when he was fasting and praying and mourning. He wasn't just complaining about the problem, but he said, send me to rebuild Jerusalem. He said, send me, and I need diplomatic papers, and I need timber, and this is how many men I need, and this is how long I will be gone, and this is when I will be back. In chapter 2 and verse 17, he is riding around the city to assess the damage, and he says to the people, he says, you see the distress that we are in. Let us build the wall of Jerusalem. And the people said, let us arise and build. But they just kept running into problems. And, we could talk about the different ways that Nehemiah handles those things. We could talk about how Nehemiah provided for the needy. He refused his rightful pay so that he could provide for them. He rebuked the nobles and the leaders for exploiting the poor. He stayed above reproach when he was tempted and walked in integrity so that no one could accuse him. He contended with those who were corrupting Israel. It even says that he struck them and he pulled out the hairs of their beard, which Olivia's done that a couple times. It really hurts. And so it's a very difficult thing to endure, but he does those things. But to me, one of the best lines in the book is chapter 4 and verse 14. Tobiah and Sanballat are closing in. They're making threats before the wall is complete. And the builders are working with a sword in one hand and with their materials in the other. And Nehemiah says to them, do not be afraid. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight. Fight for your brethren. Fight for your sons, for your daughters, for your wives, and for your houses. Do you think that has any application to us today? Because we're in a warfare too, and we're surrounded by pagan influences too. How are the walls around your home doing? What influences are making it through your defenses? Remember, you're not just fighting this battle for you, it's for your brethren. It's for your family. Don't shy away from what it says in Jude 3, making the New Testament application, where it says, contend earnestly for the faith, fight for the faith. The battle may be harder for us to see, but it says in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but it is the role of the patriarch, first, not only to fight that battle for himself, but to lead his wife, to lead his kids to go up against principalities and powers and against rulers of darkness of this present age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places, and to take up the whole armor of God. And the reality is, whether we recognize it or not, there are Tobiahs and there are Sanballats at our gates all the time. There are influences trying to make it into our lives, trying to make it into the lives of our families. What's on TV, what's coming into the home through the internet, social media, the worldviews communicated at school, and books we read, the way our kids dress in regards to modesty, the teachings they are exposed to, all the way from evolution to Calvinism. And it's our duty as men to protect ourselves and our families against these things. And it is such an important job. In Ezekiel chapter 22, God is laying out judgment, hard judgment, against Israel. It's kind of terrifying to read. The nation is filled with false prophets. They're oppressing the poor. They're failing to distinguish what is holy from what is unholy. And God is ready, he says, just to throw the whole thing into the furnace. In verse 30, he says, I sought for a man among them who would make a wall and stand in the gap before me on behalf of the land so that I would not destroy it. And I found no one. God was looking for one man who would do what it says in 1 Corinthians and act like a man, who would stand up for the truth among the false prophets, who would protect the orphans and the widows from those who are exploiting them, who would defend what is holy from being defiled. And there was no one. And so in verse 31, he says, therefore I have poured out my indignation on them, and I have consumed them with the fire of my wrath, and have recompensed their deeds upon their own heads, says the Lord. A few weeks ago, we talked about how motherhood is essential kingdom work. So is fatherhood. And while we are celebrating Father's Day today, the qualities, the work that we are discussing do not only pertain to those with physical children. How much of what we have discussed has to do with providing for orphans and widows, those who don't have the people to do for them what fathers are supposed to do? Not just providing physically, not just for literal orphans and widows, but being a patriarch to those who need it, a provider, a leader, a defender, a protector, someone to contend for the faith in their lives, to build the walls around them, and to stand on them in the gap. Okay, so we've talked about the modern campaign against patriarchy. We've talked about the vision for a restored and righteous version of that patriarchy. But how do we do this practically? And how do we not only do it ourselves, but how do we promote this in the lives of other men to be righteous leaders as well? Well, it has to start with leading our own families. And again, this is not the kind of headship that just says, I'm in charge, you have to submit to me. It is the headship in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25 that loves your wife just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. It's a leadership of example and sacrifice. But it is leadership, and it is headship. It's not just a ceremonial or symbolic position. It is a responsibility. It is accountability. We can't be passive in our role. If you drop down to chapter 6 and verse 4, it says, Fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition, or some translations say discipline and instruction of the Lord. There are a lot of men that might be like Adam in Genesis 3 and just pass that responsibility off to their wives. And they play an important role too, but who is leading in that effort? Who is taking the charge, the responsibility and accountability of that duty? Now again, this reminder is for me too as a new father, but it is dad's responsibility to say, no, we're not going to wear that. That's immodest. It is dad's responsibility to say, we are not going to watch that in this house. That's teaching you bad things about relationships. We're not going to listen to that music. It is training you to think incorrectly. We're not going to that concert. We're not going to that ball game. We're not missing an opportunity to serve God for that. It's not that mothers can't or shouldn't also be doing these things, but like the story of Deborah, that's not primarily her job, and they shouldn't have to take that responsibility because the buck stops here. Leading the discipline and the instruction of the Lord means that fathers should be leading in Bible study at home. Deuteronomy chapter 6, 7 through 9, it says, You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. The vast majority of spiritual conversation should not happen in this building if we are leading in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. We have to start there. That's the starting place. And then it spreads from there. Philip Shoemake used this illustration 4 years ago here. It really stuck with me. He said something like, I love to set sheep on fire and watch them bump into each other as they run around. And I think the way the Bible says that is iron sharpens iron. But Philip's illustration really stuck in my head, so there you go. Why is it so important that we develop strong relationships with each other outside of this building? Well, it's because we're all involved in the same warfare that primarily takes place outside of this building. It primarily takes place when we're home. And that's true for all of us. But I don't think that has traditionally been practiced enough, and especially not for men. These relationships, the Titus 2 relationships of the older leading the younger, the Jonathan and David relationships of brothers in arms strengthening each other's hands in God, those are essential in men being the leaders that they need to be. We can't do this on our own. And finally, the way that we promote godly patriarchy is by not allowing these relationships, these leadership qualities, these responsibilities to be limited by the walls of our homes. Job, Abraham, David, those men did not only perform the duty of patriarchs towards their own children. In fact, they didn't always do a great job of performing those duties towards their own children, specifically with David. But they became fathers of the communities. And this is not an uncommon way of thinking until very recently about patriarchal responsibility. Father of the community is a phrase that one historian uses to describe the duties of fathers during the American colonial period. I think this is really interesting. Another historian wrote, that all a man's household, including servants, hired hands, extended family, local orphans, apprentices, workers, whether related or not, is referred to as his family. Not that long ago in American history, Harriet Beecher Stowe's household, for example, she described it as her parents, 5 siblings, 2 aunts, an uncle, her grandmother, an orphaned cousin, 2 indentured servants, and several students that lived with them who were attending a nearby law school. That was their household. That was their family. And if we have a greater historical context for what patriarchs are, think about the influence of Cornelius. If you look in Acts chapter 10, we're told in verse 7 that Cornelius sent 2 of his household servants and a soldier from among those who waited on him continually to fetch Peter. Verse 22, Cornelius' slaves tell Peter, Cornelius is a just man, one who fears God, has a good reputation among all the nation of the Jews. Verse 24, Cornelius was waiting for them, and he had called together all his relatives and his close friends. In verse 27, Peter went to the house and discovered many who had come together. In chapter 11, verse 14, what does Peter say the angel had told Cornelius? Peter will tell you words by which you and your household will be saved. That was a lot more people than just his wife and kids. That wasn't just Cornelius' wife and kids. He'd become a patriarch, a father figure, a defender, a protector, a provider for his community. And in doing so, he was able to lead all of them towards God. Being a godly patriarch isn't only about being a father to your children. It's about being a father in the faith to anyone you can. And if you think about the biblical concept of a patriarch, isn't that just a profile of the eldership? In 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2, it mentions hospitality as a qualification. That word does not mean have people over to your house. That word, that's a modern definition. What it really means is taking care of people who need it. In the very next one, able to teach. The same idea of Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, bringing up children in the training and admonition of the Lord. Now that's applied to the congregation, those who are not the man's physical children. Verse 4 says these are men who have ruled their own houses or households well. I think it's worth noting that these are not listed as responsibilities that current elders have. They are characteristics that must be met in order to be considered to become an elder. That's a model of what it means to be a good patriarch. And it begins in the home, but it's not all about the home. It's about having that controlled strength that we talked about and using it for the betterment of everyone around you. Fatherhood, so important. Patriarchy, so important. Fathers set the tone for all those who follow them and what kind of a household they will be. They can make a difference even beyond just their physical families. I think that fathers naturally typically tend to be hard on themselves, and they always think that they could be doing better. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but don't get discouraged. We're all doing the best we can. Lead by example, prioritize the right things, love your people, follow God, and the rest falls into place. Joshua said in Joshua 24 and verse 15, "As for me and for my house, we will serve the Lord." Joshua was allowing himself to be led by God. He was commanding his household to follow his leadership under God. And by his example and influence, he was acting as a patriarch, not only to his family, but to the nation. Ultimately, promoting patriarchy is about emulating our Father in heaven, providing, protecting, leading others in the same way that he leads us. Go back to Abraham in Genesis 18, learning the way of the Lord, doing righteousness and justice, commanding those under our authority and responsibility to do the same, and showing them how. And when we do that, we become types. We become pictures of the true patriarch, who is God. Won't you submit to him today? Won't you allow him to be your patriarch, your provider, your protector, your defender, who fights battles for you? If there's anything that we can do to help you, please find me after services or come forward while we stand.